We are wrapping up a series called Shadow, and so turn with me if you want to follow along in Leviticus 23. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus. I didn't write down the number if you're going to follow this. The Bible's in front of you, but hopefully you can find it in there. We've been in there several weeks now. This is the last, the 7th week of this particular this series, and it's about these feasts that God had commanded Israel to be able to celebrate and to perform, and so it's really kind of interesting when you think about it, because they aren't suggestions of God and say, hey, this is a way to get together and do something, but they were very specific and very intentional in the way that God had described them. And so every one of these feasts had a point to them, and every one of these feasts was describing to people something about the relationship that God has with His people and with us. The first 4 we talked about were pointing in this Advent season of coming of Jesus to the first coming of Jesus, and describe this relationship being reestablished with God that we have with Him. And you could, they're online if you wanted to listen to any of them if you hadn't, but they really point to that. The last 3 were ones that foretold the second coming of Jesus, that He will come again and are really being fulfilled in the future. And we know that because the first 4 was fulfilled, then we can be certain the last 3 will be fulfilled as well. But even that, it's not just about the future, that there is something that is in these that we can learn today about our life even now when it comes to Christ and God and what He has to say and what He's trying to be able to teach us about a relationship. So today we're looking at the last one. It's called the Feast of Tabernacles. And the word that I associated with this one is the word rest. I gave a word each week to all of them, and in this particular one, it's not a sit-down rest or do-nothing rest, but it's this resting in the presence of God, resting in a relationship of a God who is in control, a God who is all-loving, a God who will do nothing but the best for us each and every moment of our life. He's never anything less. He never has a bad day. He never gets around and, I don't know if I'll do it. I'm tired of it. It's always a God who is giving us the best, and so we can rest in that and being able to understand that kind of a relationship that is being described here. And pointing to the second coming of this eternal rest that we'll have with God forever in heaven as a part of that as well. So in looking at that, I want to take a look at this. Let's first read this particular passage, and then take a look at a little bit of what it says. And so in Leviticus 23, the whole chapter is about these 7 feasts. And so you can look back later if you hadn't heard them all, but it was the Sabbath feast, and then there was the unleavened bread, and then there was the first fruits, and then there was the Feast of Weeks, which was a Pentecost. Those are the first 4. And then these are the fall feasts. There was the Feast of Trumpets. All of these took place in the 7th month of the year of the religious calendar. And so the Feast of Trumpets was on the first day of the month. And then the Feast of Atonement, the Day of Atonement, was on the 10th day of the month. And now we come to the Feast of Tabernacle, which is the 15th day. So basically in a 2-week period, these 3 feasts that God had designed all took place in the fall. And they all were tied to the end of the harvest season, the end of the productive season, if you will, of the crops and the various harvests and stuff as well in that. So let's look at this. Feast of Tabernacles, starting at verse 33, this is what we read. The Lord said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, on the 15th day of the 7th month of the Lord's Feast of Tabernacles begins, and it lasts for 7 days. The first day is a sacred assembly. Do no regular work. For the 7 days present offerings made to the Lord by fire, and on the 8th day hold a sacred assembly and present an offering made to the Lord by fire. It is a closing assembly. Do no regular work. These are the Lord's appointed feasts, which you," and now he's referring to all of them, "which you are to proclaim as sacred assemblies for bringing offerings made to the Lord by fire. The burnt offerings and the grain offerings, sacrifices, drink offerings required for each day. These offerings are in addition to those for the Lord's Sabbath, and in addition to your gifts and whatever you have vowed and all the freewill offerings you give to the Lord. So being with the 15th day of the 7th month, after you've gathered the crops of the land," so this is the end of the harvest, "celebrate the festival to the Lord for 7 days. The first day is the day of rest, and the 8th day also is a day of rest. On the first day you are to take choice fruit from the trees, and a palm fronds, leafy branches, and poplars, and rejoice before the Lord your God for 7 days. Celebrate this on a festival to the Lord for 7 days each year. This is to be a lasting ordinance for the generations to come, celebrated in the 7th month. If you've ever noticed, 7 is very popular in the Bible. I don't know if it's considered complete, but that's a whole nother subject. Celebrated the 7th month. Now here's verse 42. Live in booths for 7 days. All native-born Israelites are to live in booths, so your descendants will know that I had the Israelites live in booths when I brought them out of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So Moses announced to the Israelites the appointed feasts of the Lord. So now, here we have, and I don't know how much, this has been 7 weeks of this, and so maybe some of you are thinking, oh man, I can't wait we get past these festivals. But I found it to be very interesting, and maybe because I get to do more research than some of you do, I suppose, on this. But it's because it's just to how much God was so intentional and so detailed in what He asked and He commanded Israel to do. I mean, to live in booths? I mean, why would God do that? What was God thinking or message was God trying to get across when in the life of Israel, when He was doing all these particular detailed feasts for Israel? And then the next question then is that, okay, and it applies to me. So what is God saying to me? I mean, is God as intentional and detailed in my life? Is everything that happens in my life then therefore a purpose to it, or some design in which God is orchestrating all of this together? Well, excuse me. If you haven't learned anything else through what I've talked about, hopefully you've learned that God is very intentional. And that in fact, everything in our life, God uses. Everything in our life has a purpose and a plan before it. That we never look at a day and say, that was wasted. We might think it was wasted, but God will use every one of them because His intentionality and the way that He works and He considers through our life, we know that God uses it. He might teach us some stuff through our mistakes and our sins, or He might show us things that will help us in other ways, or He might use us to help others. Whatever it might be, there's always something that we can be learning through this. And so kind of in this one, we really want to say, what is God teaching us through this feast that He's described in here? Well, let's first of all, as we've done in the past, let's look at the background of this feast. This particular feast, if there's one word in here that's unique, it's verse 40. It says this. On this day you were to make fruit, and that says, and rejoice before the Lord your God for 7 days. All the other feasts never said rejoice. They would say a sacred assembly, consecrate yourself. They would come and worship. There was all this, but the word rejoice was in here. Like this was, of all the feasts, was a day of celebration. This, of all the feasts, was a day that you come together and you let loose, and you are just, all excited for who God is and what God did, and there was all this celebration, rejoicing that is going on in this particular feast. This is also one of the 3 feasts where you were commanded for all the men of Israel to come back to the temple for this feast to be able to worship God. Others you could stay where you're at, but this one you had to come to the temple, which was in Jerusalem, to be able to worship God. And so there, in this particular feast, then there was some major stuff that kind of went on that I, kind of highlight. There was no time to go through it all, or we couldn't go through it all. But there's some things to highlight through this that kind of really tell us some stuff about what God was trying to say. So first of all, this feast is filled with sacrifices. I won't go to it, but I wrote it in your insert if you have the time later on to go through Numbers 29. Numbers 29 goes through in depth all the sacrifices that were done to this particular feast. It's like the 12 days of Christmas kind of a thing, but it's 8 days of sacrifices, because it goes through and there's a grain offering, there's a drink offering, there's a fellowship offering, there's individual offerings of gifts that you'd give to God, and then on top of all that, it says that there each day there's 2 lambs and 14 rams are sacrificed for burnt offerings each day of the 8 days. One single goat is sacrificed for a sin offering. Then they said bulls are offered as a burnt offering beginning on the 13th day. That there's 13 bulls on the first day. The second day there's 12 bulls. The third day there's, it works its way down. There's 11 bulls and 10 bulls until you get to the 7th day. And on the 7th day there's 7 bulls that are all sacrificed.